Right, so Copernicanism without correlationism. So, in After Finitude, Quentin Meillassoux introduces the term correlationism to group together various forms of epistemological relativism that rose to prominence in the wake of Kant's transcendental idealism, most significantly in 20th century European philosophy. In their own way, each of these positions denies the possibility of absolute knowledge, which is not to say knowledge that is absolutely certain, but rather knowledge of the world as it is in itself, independently of the manner in which we think it. In addition to providing a general account of correlationism that aims to capture the common rationale of these positions, Meillassoux provides a specific diagnosis of Kant's role as the father of correlationism. In particular, he identifies Kant's self-described Copernican turn, the methodological shift from examining the conformity of our thought to objects to the conformity of our objects to thought, as the origin of transcendental idealism and its myriad correlationist descendants. As such, he sees Kant's Copernicanism as a betrayal of the epistemological legacy of Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Descartes, who, in laying the foundations for the mathematization of natural science, for the first time gave us access to those primary qualities that constitute reality itself, for example, extension, motion, and force, shorn of the secondary qualities that merely appear for us, for example, colour, taste, and smell. Rebranding Kant's turn a Ptolemaic revolution, his diagnosis culminates in a perceptive analysis of its motivations. So here's a quote from Meillassoux. But what was the goal of this Ptolemaic revolution in philosophy? And what did it hope to achieve? What was the fundamental question on the basis of which the first critique reconfigured the whole of philosophy? It was the question about the conditions under which modern science is thinkable. That is to say, the conditions of the Copernico-Galilean revolution in the literal and genuine sense of the term. In other words, the philosopher who placed the task of understanding the conditions of possibility for modern science at the heart of his project is also the philosopher who responded to this exigency by abolishing its initial condition. Thus, the Copernico-Galilean decentering carried out by modern science gave rise to a Ptolemaic counter-revolution in philosophy. Now, there is something importantly correct about this analysis, and Meillassoux' broader claims about correlationism and Kant's role in its genesis. However, Meillassoux is all too quick to identify Kant's Copernicanism with his correlationism, and thereby to dismiss the possibility that Kant's transcendental methodology could be salvaged from the wreckage of his transcendental idealism. The aim of the present paper is to explore this possibility by reconstructing Meillassoux' account of correlationism on the one hand, and reconstructing Kant's methodological Copernicanism on the other. These reconstructions will proceed in parallel, drawing on one another as appropriate, and the first half of the paper will focus more on correlationism and the second more on Copernicanism. And we'll probably have more time for the first half of the paper than what's there in the second half of the paper, just to warn you. But hopefully we will get there. So, let's begin by talking about certain conditions on these reconstructions before we get into them, or certain resources that can be provided for them. So, although Meillassoux frames correlationism and its competitors in terms of the manner they configure the relationship between subject and object, it's useful to reframe them in terms of the relationship between thought and being. And there are three different dimensions of this reframing that it's important to highlight in advance. So first of all, there's a methodological dimension. We can ask, are we thinking about this relation between thought and being from the side of thought, or are we thinking about it from the side of being? Which is to say, are we thinking it in epistemological or metaphysical, or I'll use the word ontological terms. Secondly, we can think about differences between form and content. So, for instance, the categories or forms of intuition as forms of thought versus judgments and objects of experience as contents, or being and beings on the side of being, if we're interested in being a bit Heideggerian. Thirdly, there's a substantive dimension, namely, we can distinguish different modalities of thought and being and the ways in which they're related. So we might want to talk about, say on the side of thought, we might want to talk about judgment, cognition, experience, practice, and on the side of being, we might want to talk about being and thought themselves, but also perhaps seeming or appearance as a modality of being. And the last one there is the ought, which Heidegger also flags up. What resources and ideas do we have to use in reconstructing Kant? So I think there are three core ideas that it's important to focus on in Kant. First of all, there is the primacy of judgment. So what this means essentially is that for Kant, all thought is judgment. That's the minimal structure of thought, right? So all experience is cognition, but not all cognition is experience. All cognition is judgment, but not all thought is judgment. Not all thought is cognition. Crucially, this primacy of judgment also applies in terms of the way in which Kant thinks the relationships between the different faculties, which is fundamentally based on the kind of inheritance of Aristotelian logic. Crucially, so you have this distinction between the understanding, judgment, and reason, the faculty of terms, so the faculty of concepts, which is the logic of terms, the faculty of judgments, and the faculty of inferences. In each case, judgment is sort of understood as being primary, and you understand the other two in terms of judgment. Thirdly, there's this important relationship between sensibility and understanding, which is at the level of terms in the Aristotelian framework. Crucially, this is the difference between singular and general terms. Sensibility is what gives you the capacities required for singular thought and judgment, and understanding is about general concepts and general judgments. Right? Okay. The second crucial idea is objective validity, and this, I think, really is the crucial difference between Kant and Descartes. So, essentially, what Kant is trying to think when he's thinking the relationship between the subject and the object is he is trying to think about the truth aptness of our judgments. He's trying to think the sense in which they can possibly be true or false, which is fundamentally, for him, what it is to be responsible for making an objective judgment. So this is like the sort of first dimension of the Kantian problematic. Right? What is it to be responsible for an objective judgment? And that's the relationship to the object. The second dimension of this is what is it to be capable of bearing this responsibility? What do you have to do in order to take on this normative status of being so responsible? And this is where we start talking about conditions of subjectivity, not just the relationship to the object. And finally, we have this question, how do objects and concepts constrain one another? So given that initial Aristotelian framing of sensibility and understanding in terms of the relationship between singular and general, right, every singular term is going to fall under a general term. It's always going to be an instance of a general. But for that general concept to have objective reality such that those judgments have this kind of normative status, they have to, in some sense, be constrained by the singular things they're picking out. Right? So there's this kind of reciprocal constraint of singular and general. And the final core idea, I think, of Kant's philosophy, which I'm going to talk more about, is constructivism. And this fundamentally relates to the second question here. So what is it to be capable of this responsibility? But what is it to be capable of this relationship to an object? The core part of Kant's answer here is the ability to construct it in intuition, the ability to exhibit objects of possible experience in intuition. And he talks about this in two different ways. Almost everybody focuses on the first, which is how this applies to mathematics. So for Kant, mathematical judgments are fundamentally based, like their truth is fundamentally based on your ability to perform the constructions which exhibit the relevant features. Your ability to actually do like Euclidean geometry with ruler and compass, or to do the same thing in your imagination. But he also discusses empirical experiment in exactly the same terms. Crucially, in both cases, what's at stake is, and this is the third point here, rules and representativeness. Right? It's the construction, the fact that the constructions take place in accordance with rules that establishes this relationship between the singular and the general. Right? So when you construct like a singular triangle, either on paper or in your imagination, the fact that you are constructing in accordance with rules makes that singular instance a representative instance of the general, and thus enables you to prove things about the general. Crucially, Kant thinks the same about experiment. It's just that the rules are not simply rules of construction and pure intuition. They're about they're rules governing the manipulation and observation of certain systems. Crucially, they're the underpinnings of scientific models, and that's essentially what Ken was talking about yesterday, I think. Okay, so those are the core ideas of Kant's philosophy that will come back in. I'll talk more about all of them. Here are my key reconstructive principles. And when I say I'm aiming to reconstruct Kant here, I mean that both in the sense of trying to provide a better reading of what Kant himself was doing, and in the sense of trying to carry Kant's project beyond what he himself achieved. These two dimensions of reconstruction will kind of be confused to some extent in the paper, but they can be pulled apart. Anyway, first of all, transcendental method. I think... bit of my slide hasn't worked. Transcendental reflection should have a line through it. It does? Yes. Okay, it doesn't display that on my... Oh, okay, it's fine. I think it's useful to make this distinction between transcendental deontology and transcendental psychology. And fundamentally, this corresponds to the two questions I pointed out before. Right? Transcendental deontology is the study of the normative statuses, like the study of the responsibilities that we have in being able to make objective judgments. Transcendental psychology is the study of the capacities. Right? And these two things are kind of run together throughout Kant, just under the name of conditions of the possibility of experience, but it's even though they are still crucially related, it's worth pulling them apart in order to relate them better. And one of the reasons for this is it enables us to weed out transcendental reflection, which I think, in terms of reconstructing Kant's project, we have to just get rid of. We have to get rid of any kind of dependence upon introspection, because that where Husserl lies, and that fundamentally is the refuge of contingency. Well, this is something that we'll get to talk about. How do I go about this? Well, fundamentally, you might call the overall scope of my project computational Kantianism. So, fundamentally, I read Kant as a functionalist. I think that's a fairly sensible way to read Kant. But if you read Kant's faculty psychology as about functions for processing information, right? So Kant's concept of representation is very weak, and this has been noted by many people. If you replace it with the concept of information, it becomes a lot more malleable, and you can think about this functional structure in computational terms, and it can actually be quite illuminating. And one of the reasons it can be very illuminating is because it gives you a way of understanding the relationship between deontology and psychology, right? Which is in terms of the principle of ought implies can. Right? So the idea is, ought implies can is fundamentally, if you're not capable of doing what you're supposedly responsible for, you're not responsible for it. right? So this provides a way in which actual functional constraints on psychology, which are computational constraints, can actually constrain the normative ones, right? And this will be important as I go through. Also, I mean, I've pointed this out as finitude, right? What computer science gives you is a way of thinking finitude quite rigorously here, insofar as precisely what computational constraints are, in most cases, are constraints on what can be computed by a finite being with a finite amount of storage in a finite amount of time. Right. Anyway, finally, inferentialism. Right. Crucially, Sellers and Brandam's inferentialist program is, well, they themselves see it as a kind of reinterpretation of Kant and Hegel. With Sellers, it's more Kant. With Brandam, it's more Hegel. I think this is largely right, but there are bits of Kant that crucially get left by the wayside. And it's useful to be able to contrast inferentialism with Kant's constructivism, both because it'll reveal precisely what Kant's constructivism is doing and how we can perhaps, what bits of it we need to keep and what bits of it we need to get rid of. We'll get to that. Okay. Correlationism. So, Mayasu's way of describing correlationism, as I mentioned before, is fundamentally in terms of the relationship between subject and object. And he basically sets out the difference between realism, idealism, and correlationism in terms of what gets priority here. Is it the object? That's realism. Is it the subject? That's idealism. Is it the relation between them? That's correlationism. Great. And he then distinguishes between correlationisms of various sorts, crucially between weak correlationism, which is Kant, but also, well, actually, there isn't that many other good examples, but, and then strong correlationism, which is a variety of people, including Husserl, Heidegger, the later Wittgenstein, and a whole variety of people. And then he distinguishes within these between what he'd call universalist and pluralist correlationism. And crucially, these are about whether or not the conditions of subjectivity that define the relationship are taken to be universal or plural. So with Kant, there's some sense in which the conditions governing our thought as finite beings are applicable to all finite beings, regardless of whether they're human. There's some more universal scope, whereas for Heidegger, say, there is a kind of strong historical relativity of these conditions to our given culture that we're in. You can talk about other people on language games. You can talk about various different kinds of plurality here in terms of historical, cultural, or even biological conditions, right? But Mayasu wants to say that both of these are still correlations in one form or another. Okay. Here is the dialectic of correlationism as Mayasu sees it. It's very much a reconstruction. He acknowledges this, but it's worth going through it. So, you start off with naive realism. We just know things as they are. The naive realist gets confronted with a circle of correlation, which is very primitively, you think that you're talking about the things in themselves, but really you're just talking about them as they are for you, right? And that, well, no, that's just for you, not as it is in itself. That gesture can essentially be infinitely repeated, no matter what the naive realist returns with. And so, on the basis of this, apparently, we end up at weak correlationism, as I say, as Kant. And the crucial distinguishing feature of this for Mayasu is that Kant thinks that the in itself is thinkable but not knowable. And what he means by this is it gives us a kind of limit knowledge, which is we know that the in itself exists and that it is non-contradictory. But beyond that, we can't know anything. And we know that simply because those are the conditions of its thinkability. Okay. The response to weak correlationism is what he calls the absolutization of the correlation, which ends up at absolute idealism, namely Hegel. Right? In essence, we point out, or Hegel points out, that the idea of the in itself, the noumenon as it is conceived, is fundamentally incoherent in some way. And so the correlation is treated as absolute now. We have a full metaphysics of the correlation. Mayhew's response to this is the argument from facticity. Well, not Mayhew's response, but he takes the strong correlationist response to be this argument from facticity, which is essentially that the correlation itself is factical, like it's contingent, because we contingently exist. Right? And this gets us to strong correlationism, in which we can't even say about the in itself that it exists and that it's non-contradictory. Those facts that were previously conditions of thinking are now incorporated into our culture or our biology or whatever the conditions are. Okay. Finally, we get to Mayhew, who tries to turn this on the strong correlationist to get to his own position of speculative materialism. It's called the absolutization of facticity, in which essentially he points out that the initial gesture, the circle of correlation, that the weak correlationist used against the naive realist can't be used against the facticity of the correlation. Right? That gesture bottoms out in, well, there's just got to be some kind of absolute possibility that we're appealing to here. There's so much wrong with this, but it's worth to lay it out as it is. Okay. Let's reframe Mayhew's correlationism using the dimensions I put forward earlier. So first of all, the methodological question. Are we dealing with epistemology or ontology here? In fact, I'm going to go back a slide. Right? Interestingly enough, all of the positions over this side, naive realism, absolute idealism, speculative materialism, those are all obviously ontology or metaphysics. Right? They're claims about being. Right? What's over this side, weak correlationism and strong correlationism, have they extracted themselves from ontology and metaphysics, or and become just purely epistemological, or not? The interesting point is that the consequences of these positions are essentially epistemological, but the premises are articulated in essentially ontological terms. Why? And essentially it's the choice of the subject-object framing and this choice is essentially a response to the rhetoric of phenomenology in Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and their inheritors. I think we can easily reframe this in terms of the... let me say that again. I think we can easily reframe this in terms of the separation of epistemic norms that has been extant since Kant's refutation of idealism. So, for instance, the separation between transcendentally ideal and empirically real, or ontological and ontic. Right? The question remains whether the premises can still be rendered entirely non-ontological, but this is a good step in the right direction. So secondly, the structural question. The circle of correlation is articulated in essentially Berkeleyan or Fichtean terms that obscure the distinction, leaning towards a simplistic essayist percepi reading, which identifies the subject and the object in some way. Why is this? This way of elaborating the subject-object relation collapses the complexity of the various arguments and auxiliary assumptions used to motivate distinct forms of correlationism into a single simple argument. Basically means Mayhew doesn't have to deal with all of the varieties of correlationism, he can just deal with one. However, we can easily reframe the debate between realism, idealism, and correlationism as principally concerning the structures of thought and being, rather than their contents. So crucially, here you don't get a good sense of what the difference is between, say, Hegel's idealism and Berkeley's idealism, right? But if we start talking about the relationship between thought and being, we can. So what I'm recommending here is to emphasize instead Mayhew's image of the transparent cage, which I think is a wonderful phrase. So what this means is that correlationism essentially consists in treating contingent epistemic conditions as insurmountable epistemic constraints. Now, he's correct to say that Kant relativizes objective validity to conditions of possible experience, and thereby reduces it to an intersubjective norm indexed to these conditions. I don't want to put too much weight into that word intersubjective. What I mean by it is simply not really objective. Somehow less than objective. It's been relativized to something. Okay. Now, the substantive question: are we dealing with the same modalities of thought and being across all of these cases? I think it's fairly obvious that weak correlationism depends on two different modal distinctions. It distinguishes the subject's activity and cognition from mere thinking, and it distinguishes the corresponding objects by dividing appearance from reality. For Kant, this provides us with a minimal knowledge of the in itself, namely that it meets the minimal requirements of thinkability, existence and non-contradiction. According to Meillassoux, strong correlationism rejects even this minimal knowledge by denying that the in itself is thinkable. The problem is, how can this unthinkability of the in itself be thought, let alone known? How can strong correlationists even articulate their position? If we're to avoid presenting strong correlationism as immediately incoherent, then we should reframe the relative strength of forms of correlationism purely in terms of the epistemic constraints that they propose, and understand these constraints in terms of how they articulate the relevant modalities of thought and being. So, strong correlationism is able to relegate existence and non-contradiction from the structure of reality to the structure of appearance because it posits a form of thinking more primitive than judgment, right? Such as fundamental moods, ethics, or axiomatic praxis. So that's Heidegger, Derrida, and Laruelle, if you're interested. There can equally be weaker forms of correlationism that permit more knowledge of reality and its relation to appearance than Kant, by proposing additional conditions on judgment. So I take Badiou as being the characteristic example of this. For Badiou, the noumenon, you can say more about it than that it exists and that it's non-contradictory. You have the whole of axiomatic set theory to work through, right? But nothing more. Nevertheless, in every case, there remains something inherently ontological, albeit framed as a new kind of liminal thinking of one kind or another. So in Heidegger, we have Gelassenheit, and Derrida, we have deconstruction. These things are essentially usurping the role that metaphysics previously played. Okay, so I've got this sort of spectrum of weak, strong correlationism. Okay. How does Meillassoux characterize Kant's correlationism specifically, and how do we fit it into this reframing? This is where I'm going to go over the same rough areas that Jim did in his talk. So, Meillassoux' critique of Kant's manifestation is essentially, he says, that the transcendental conditions need to be manifest in a thinker, right? And in essence, the objects that are given are always going to be relative to the existence of that thinker in some way, right? And it's that creates the condition of the transparent cage. I think it's useful to see why Meillassoux does this. And I think it's fundamentally because of the contrast between universalism and pluralism. Right, so when you're dealing with pluralist correlationism, it's quite clear where the contingency lies. The contingency lies in the fact that we could have a different language, a different culture, a different biology, right? When you're dealing with universalist correlationism, you can't identify the contingency as consisting in the same possibility of variation, right? So what Meillassoux does is to shift the contingency from the character of the conditions to their existence, because the contingency of something existing is more primordial than the fact that it could be otherwise. The fact that it could not be is more primitive than the fact that it could be otherwise. And he basically aims to use that as a kind of brute force argument against all kinds of correlationism. It fundamentally doesn't work. The main reason for this is that it really doesn't understand Kant on manifestation. So for Kant, the manifestation of the transcendental is essentially about the implementation of these functional structures, right? So this, and interestingly, this gives you a way of thinking about contingency and variation quite naturally, because if you've got a function, it can be realized in multiple ways. Like, crucially, the question of how it's realized is contingent in some important way, right? And interestingly enough, the question of what implies can comes in here, insofar as you can reframe Kant's restriction to objective validity or into subjective validity, however you want to talk about it, in terms of the fact that we can't construct things in themselves as they are in intuition. Like our forms of sensibility don't enable us to do that, and so there's an important sense in which we're not responsible for doing that. The standard is weakened in that way. The standard is then separated out, right? That there is a kind of the idea of the noumenon as a standard in itself is retained because Kant postulates the possibility of intellectual intuition. He postulates the possibility that there is something that can do that, right? So actually there is this kind of there is this variation in Kant, but the variation is purely between are you a finite being or are you God? It's purely between whether you have sensible forms of intuition or intellectual ones. Okay. Now, does Mayhew's account of the manifestation of the transcendental get any purchase on Kant at all? For Kant, there are two distinct senses in which the existence of objects is relative to space and time as conditions of possible experience. Firstly, as conditions of synthesis, namely forms of intuition, and secondly, as conditions of reference, what we might call relations of location. Right? There's no useful sense in which space and time can be said to exist qua forms of intuition. This is what Jim has already said. So Mayhew's account gets no purchase on that front. However, when it comes to locating objects in a unitary spatio-temporal referential framework, we have no choice in practice but to locate them relative to ourselves, and thus to our own existence. So the point is, if I knock you out and throw you in a field somewhere in the world and you wake up, right, you need to start reconstructing a kind of reference frame in terms of which you can relate things. You know, that's over there, relative to me. Basically, you have this, and this is what the analogies are all about. Basically, is you have this framework of interacting substances in relation to which you can have stable consciousness, but you can also locate everything, and ultimately, you know, when you get the bus home, you can relate those things that you encountered there to things you encountered before, and you can build a wider framework of individuals that you can refer to. Okay. Nevertheless, the purchase that this gives Mayhew reveals the deeper flaws in his account, insofar as the contingency of our existence is not an insurmountable constraint in this case. So, although Kant thinks that the capacity to maintain an autonomous referential framework, this is what I mean by if you suddenly have discontinuity of consciousness and you wake up someone you don't know, you need to be able to build a new referential framework, right? The capacity to do that is a functional condition of self-consciousness. You need this in order to have unity of self-consciousness in this judgment, right? Objective validity is secured by our capacity to coordinate, integrate, and ultimately revise our personal frameworks into a global framework, right? What we call a global referential framework. So the manner in which the forms of space and time functions as conditions of this process might still impose constraints on it, and thereby cause this reduction from objective validity into subjective validity. But this concerns the fact that these conditions might be otherwise, not the fact that there's some kind of relativization to our existence. Right. So if there's any correlationism still in here, it's to do with the conditions upon our constructing of referential systems placing constraints on what we can refer to, right? Okay. How much time do I have left as a reasonable?
Say 20 minutes to be generous.
Okay. So, have that distinction between conditions of synthesis, conditions of reference, and autonomous referential frameworks and global referential frameworks. Right. So, we've now located the point in Mayhew's account of correlationism where he conflates epistemology and ontology. But it's reasonably clear that this isn't an intrinsic feature of correlationism. It certainly isn't in Kant's case, as we've just demonstrated. However, this doesn't mean that there isn't a deeper connection between epistemology and ontology built into the structure of Kant's transparent cage. If you want to properly understand and assess Kant's correlationism, then we're going to have to examine the relationship between the form and content of thought in more detail. It's worth beginning with the account of thought that Mayhew thinks provides the most basic form of the circle of correlation, namely Fichte's initial account of consciousness and the Wissenschaftslehre. Right, so this is better than Berkeley, but not by much, at least, if you can see what its consequences are. So what is this definition? The I posits the not I is not posited. Right? Consciousness thinks about its object and attempts to think the object is independent of its thinking. However, in doing so, it ends up in a pragmatic contradiction. The fact that it posits the object contradicts the content that it posits, namely that the object is not posited. How do we relate this to Kant? Well, I think the most important thing to recognize about this is that this isn't really judgment. Right? This like what's called positing here isn't really the structure of judgment. There isn't really a proper subject-predicate structure, even if we want to say there's something like content here. Nevertheless, it is a lot like construction and intuition. And in fact, there's no coincidence about this. Fichte himself was very much concerned with dealing with the constructive operations of the imagination, but he was dealing with them as acts, as things that we have control over in a pure sense. The question is, how does this carry over to Kant's account of judgment, insofar as Kant thinks judgment and the relation to the object in judgment in terms of this kind of construction? Right, so how can we contrast these? And another way of putting this is to say, how strong is Kant's constructivism? Right? So one way to elaborate that question would be, precisely what does Kant think we have to do constructively when we're thinking about unobservables? Right? So if we're doing physics and we're happy to posit like unobservable particles, right? In what sense do we have to be able to construct those in intuition? Right? What constraints on our imagination are at work here? Right? Do I have to think of them as having colour? Do I have to think of them as having various other sensory properties that I'm familiar with, or kind of, that's I'm not going to necessarily answer that question, but it's the question that's relevant. So really what's at issue here is the relationship between content and objective validity. And Kant sort of identifies these two things too quickly. So for Kant, for a judgment to have content is for it to have a relationship to an object, to have objective validity. He makes this very explicit in the distinction between general and transcendental logic, where general logic deals with judgments insofar as they lack content, and transcendental logic deals with them insofar as they have content, right? And having content is described simply as having relationship to an object. And what this reveals is that really there are two components to content in Kant. There's the component that Sellers and Brandom extract and develop independently, which is the concept. And the concept is understood as a function of judgment, right? So essentially we understand the content of concepts in terms of inferential relations between judgments, right? And how the concepts in those judgments contribute to them. And on the other hand, we have schema, which are sort of inherently tied to concepts in Kant. And these are the rules for construction and intuition, right? So the concept of a triangle is fundamentally tied to the schema of a triangle for constructing. And we might also want to say that concepts of empirical objects are tied to empirical schema, which deal with how we engage with them in intuition, up to and including scientific measurement in the manner that Ken was laying out yesterday. This is where inferentialism is useful, because it shows us what you can do independently of the schema. If we just focus on the content, if we just focus on conceptual content, right, in this limited inferential sense, how much can we get? And that gives us a kind of base case to start thinking about the strength of Kant's constructivism. I'm not really going to elaborate the basis of Sellers and Brandam's inferentialism. I don't have that much time, so we all should understand basically that it's about functional role semantics, about the role that judgments and their components play within inference. It's what Brandam calls strong inferentialism, which is to say that this functional role is not just about inference, right? So there are non-inferential entries into discourse, perception, and there are non-inferential exits from discourse, action, right? But fundamentally, if you didn't have inference connecting these two things, you wouldn't have content. So this is Brandam's famous parrot example, right? And again, Ken talked about this a bit yesterday in terms of, like, if there are no consequences of applying or classifying something with a concept, then you don't really have a concept. Okay. Two more final points here. The other thing that this gives you is you can start thinking about singular concepts. So you can start thinking about, say, like proper names, right? Just as being conceptual rather than being intuitive. You have to, if you get rid of schema to some extent. And finally, those non-inferential functional components of these roles, the entry and exit from discourse, are understood in terms of what Brandam calls reliable differential responsive dispositions, which is essentially your capacities, your functional capacities for perception and action, right? And it's these that are supposed to give us relation to the object without the constructive element, right? This is the alternative story for relationship to the object. And crucially, what underlies this is the idea that these capacities are themselves causally analyzable, right? So they, like, we can actually reason about how it is that we go from causal stimulus to judgment, right? That's a kind of crucial point of Sellers' story, right? Hegel. Why am I bringing in Hegel? Hegel is incredibly useful if you want to build up and see what's wrong in Fichte's account of consciousness. And I think if you want to relate it to Brandam and Sellers. So, here is Hegel's alternative account of consciousness, what he calls the concept of natural consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit. It has two fundamental components and then two implications. The first is consciousness relates itself to its object or takes its object to be a certain way. And what this means just is that it makes a judgment about its object, right? So we're in judgment here, right? Secondly, consciousness distinguishes between its relating and the object as it is in itself. So in essence, consciousness allows for the possibility of error. Right? In making a judgment, you allow that your judgment could be false. These then have two implications. Because consciousness itself makes the distinction between judgment and the object it is about, the object cannot truly be in itself, but must be for consciousness. What this means is that consciousness must have a concept of its object. Right? However, this is the final point and the really crucial one, consciousness cannot be aware that the object is for it without ceasing to be consciousness, without getting rid of the possibility of error, right? And thus it must suppress this fact. And what this means is that consciousness cannot recognize that the concept of the object is dependent on it without undermining the possibility of error. Okay, I'll go back. The ambiguity between judgment and object, content, and concept, which is at the heart of the Fichtean approach, gets resolved by having both propositions about concepts here, judgments, and concepts of judgments. Consciousness undertakes responsibility for its judgments by establishing the object as an independent standard distinct from them. It's precisely by giving the object authority over whether its judgment is correct that consciousness opens up the possibility of error. The next thing to note is that Hegel has essentially split Fichte's notion of positing as not positing as not posited, into two distinct subjective acts. What I'm going to call withdrawing authority, so point 2, and suppressing the concept, point 4. Withdrawing authority is just a different way of talking about the way that consciousness opens up the possibility of error. Granting authority to the object over whether one's judgments about it are correct can also be viewed as a matter of withdrawing one's own authority over one's claims. In doing so, one thereby undertakes a responsibility to provide reasons why one's claim is correct if it's challenged. This is essentially Brandam's account. We feed into Brandam's idea that, in essence, assertion is about undertaking a responsibility to justify. It's precisely by undertaking a responsibility to give reasons for one's claims about an object that one thereby undertakes a responsibility to that object. In effect, what this means is that judgments are essentially open to debate. In contrast to this, the content of concepts is not always open to debate. This is because mutual grasp of a concept is a condition of the possibility of disagreement about anything. For example, if we can only have a genuine argument about whether Bill Clinton is a saxophonist, if we both We can only have a genuine argument about whether Bill Clinton is a saxophonist if we both understand who Bill Clinton is and what being a saxophonist entails. The point is that in order to open up the possibility of error, we must nonetheless exclude some things from the resulting debate. So while we accept the possible difference between our judgments and the objects in themselves, we suppress the possible difference between our concepts and the objects they stand for. The basic idea is fairly simple, right? Any disagreement presupposes some prior agreement, implicitly, right, on the conditions that make it possible. Okay. I think this gives us the resources to distinguish between two different ways of understanding the notion of the in itself. So we can talk about, on the one hand, mind independence. An object is in itself if its existence is independent of the existence of minds, right? Which is fundamentally an ontological notion, an ontological way of conceiving dependence, right? Versus attitude independence. An object is in itself if its character is independent of the way we take it to be, which is more epistemological, right? And it's this notion of attitude independence, which is precisely what's at stake in this possibility of error, in this withdrawal of authority. We're trying to acknowledge that the way things are can be other than the way we take them to be. The problem is that it also opens up a contrast between what we might think of as relative and absolute attitude independence. Right? Although there's this minimal condition, right, that we have to acknowledge that we can be wrong about some things, we don't necessarily have to acknowledge that we can be wrong about everything. Crucially, we don't have to acknowledge that we're wrong about the beliefs and commitments that make it possible for us to refer to the things in the first place. Right? However, precisely what we want to think of as genuine objectivity involves some kind of absolute independency. Right? What we want is some sort of not merely relative withdrawal of our authority over the way the world can be, but or the truth of our claims about it, but some kind of absolute authority. However, this discussion of responsibility and authority presupposes some notion of control that there's some sense in which we have a choice on how we set up the possibility of disagreement. And in fact, this is where the sort of, really where the notion of givenness is important, because precisely what underlies sort of something like Kant's correlationism is the idea that there are some things that we don't have any control over. There are some conditions governing the way in which we refer to things that we have no control over. Nevertheless, that still means that we can't refer to things as they are in themselves. We can only refer to them as they are for us. Okay. I'm nearly at the end, or rather nearly at the end of what I can get to. So what we have really is a split between two different ways of thinking about objectivity. Objectivity is reference, and objectivity is revisability. And crucially, when we're talking about these things that we have to agree on in order to have disagreement, like agreement upon the content of our concepts, we seem to be talking about what Kant calls the analytic. Right? There are some things, judgments, that we simply have to accept as being true in virtue of the content of the concept. Right? Switching back to Brandom, you might think that in order to defend a more robust notion of objectivity here, you have to reject this split between the analytic and the synthetic. You have to defend some kind of robust semantic holism in order to allow that absolutely everything in the content of your concept can potentially be revised. And Brandon provides an account of how this is done in terms of de re and dicto attribution and perspectival navigation. Basically, what this involves is we have the ability simply to stipulate that we're talking about the same thing. We have the ability simply to just go like, look, when you say that, that's what I mean by this, right? And then we go from there, and we try and map our different conceptions of things onto one another, but we don't have to necessarily presuppose some explicit conception of what the thing is we're referring to in advance, right? This, I think, is Brandam's most interesting insight, right? In fact, in effect, it amounts to a kind of in principle, in practice distinction, right? Which we could talk about in computational terms. So you can say that, well, it might be the case that in practice, we have to have some set of sort of common beliefs or common orientations in order to secure common reference, but there's nothing telling us what those commonalities necessarily have to be. There's no specific set of commonalities in any given case, and what that means is, in principle, everything is revisable. All of our concepts and all of our beliefs are revisable, even if, in practice, we have to keep some fixed at any given time. Okay. The problem with this is that minimal structure of objectivity as reference that Brandam outlines doesn't have what Kant wants when he talks about objective validity, which is it doesn't have a relationship to objects of experience that are constraining us. And this is a complaint that has been made about Brandam before, but the simple way to demonstrate it is this structure of objectivity as reference is precisely the same when I say, Odin, he's basically Zeus. We're basically talking about the same mythical figure, right? Or for any fictional object that we can refer to, which we can refer to, right? We can have all of these interesting conversations about things which have content, right? We can have legitimate disagreements, right? But for which there is nothing resembling what we might want to think of as genuine, absolute attitude independence, because these things are, at the end of the day, somehow relative to our attitudes, even if we've created a little pocket of the possibility of error. So Brandam's account isn't sufficient, right, to get at genuine objective validity, right? So what about objectivity as revisability, right? What if there's a particular kind of revision of beliefs which is specific to engagement with experience and experimental science, right? There basically is this also in Brandam's account, but he doesn't highlight it or indicate it very well. And it has two components, basically. One, which he gets from Sellers, which is this idea of RDRDs, right? And the idea fundamentally that they are completely causally analyzable. What this means is, for when we have non-inferential entry transitions in a discourse and perception, when we make perceptual judgments, what we have is a kind of testimonial authority, which is fundamentally a provisional authority, right? If I know that basically your perceptual systems seem to be working, I'm just going to trust that when you make judgments that they're correct, right? But that authority is not stipulative. It's something that can be brought into question, and fundamentally bringing it into question is an empirical matter itself. When I bring into question your perceptual judgments, I'm not stepping out of the space of observational argument, right? I'm just coming at it from a different angle. We'll start talking about the actual causal components of your perceptual systems, right? The second component of Brandam's account is the idea that not merely our beliefs but our concepts are revisable insofar as the connection between what he calls their circumstances of application and their consequences of application can contradict experience. So the single example he has for this is a very potted example where he says, so imagine you've got this concept acid, right? And its circumstances of application are, if it tastes sour, it's an acid, right? So when you go around tasting stuff and you go, that's an acid, that's an acid, that's an acid, right? And the consequence of that is that it should turn litmus paper red, right? You know that, well, that's going to turn litmus paper red, that's going to turn litmus paper red, so on and so forth, right? If you then actually go around and test the things with litmus paper and it turns out one of them doesn't turn litmus paper red, then your concept is bad and it needs revision, right? The general concept you've been applying to these things needs to be revised. And this is what gives Brandam what I called this reciprocal constraint between singular and general, right? Okay. I'm very near the end here, but there's just a few more things I want to flag up before going back to Copernicanism. First of all, what we have here is something like a distinction between logical objects and empirical objects. And I want to flag this up because when people use the term object, it means a whole variety of different things to different people. Sometimes people mean it in this minimal logical sense, which is just whatever we can refer to, like, you know, the Golden Mountain is an object, the round square, Popeye, whatever, right? What we get with objectivity as reference is it is precisely this minimal concept, right? That consistency is a kind of condition of the possibility of disagreement, right? In the case of empirical objects, the consistency of the singular things, the fact that they can't bear incompatible properties or whatever, is supposed to be the condition of the possibility of revision. We could talk about that more. Okay, here's the big problem for Brandam, right? And it reveals the big problem for Kant, and this is why I've gone through Brandam, right? How do we revise not simply the criteria of application of our concepts, but the criteria of identity of the objects that permit us to revise the concepts we apply to them? So crucially, that concept of acid, right? What we're talking about in circumstances and consequences is just applying qualities to them. We're not talking about how it is that we pick out instances of acid. In fact, if you listen to Brandam's story, acid as a concept is going to get these criteria from a deeper concept, namely liquid. Right? It's going to be acid as an instance of liquid. That's the fundamental type, right? But how could we ever revise the conditions of individuation of liquid, right? And the fact that we have to do this is what's important for the scientific image and for science. The example of liquid is fairly potted because, again, it's something that we're familiar with in what sellers would call the manifest image. We're fairly comfortable with medium-sized dry goods and even medium-sized wet goods too, right? When you start talking about things like weather systems, right, or quantum particles, or any of the myriad interesting things that get modeled by the scientific image, the need to revise our criteria of identity, the ways we're actually individuating things that we're talking about, becomes incredibly important, right? And that's what's not here, right? There's still some kind of fundamental analytic thing in here which is restricting the holistic revision process, right? And this is what I mean about the kind of remaining connection between epistemology and ontology. Individuation is the interstitial zone between epistemology and ontology, where attitude independence shades into where attitude dependence shades into mind dependence, right? And it's from this that correlationism emerges. And this makes a lot of sense if you read anything on individuation and analytic metaphysics, where there is this ambiguity between whether individuation is an epistemological or a metaphysical term. Are we talking about epistemology or metaphysics when we're talking about individuation? There is a crucial ambiguity which only occasionally gets referred to. So I'm going to close here by coming back to the notion of Copernicanism. And I think really when Meillassoux calls Kant's philosophy a Ptolemaic revolution, what he's actually doing is trying to claim Copernicanism for himself. Right? And what this reveals is actually two different competing claims to the title of Copernicanism, each with a historical and a metaphorical component, namely a tie to the legacy of the mathematization of natural science and a narrative of reversal and decentering. On the one hand, we have Cartesian Copernicanism, which sees the mathematical revolution in experimental science as providing access to the primary qualities of the natural world, thereby decentering human experience and those secondary qualities that are given in it alone. And the signature achievement here is Descartes' invention of analytic geometry and its consequences for mechanics. Whereas on the other hand, we have Kant's Copernicanism, which sees the mathematical revolution in experimental science as not simply providing us with new purchase on qualities, but new purchase on the objects that bear them, enacting a decentering which moves beyond questioning the givenness of qualities in order to question the givenness of objects. The signature achievement here is Newton's invention of calculus and its consequences for dynamics, or the mathematical study of forces producing changes in motion, and ultimately changes that have nothing to do with motion. And that's the crucial advance on Descartes. Meillassoux' Cartesian focus on the split between primary and secondary qualities indicates that he is not sufficiently concerned with the questions regarding object individuation that motivate Kant's Copernicanism. The irony is that it's precisely these concerns that validate Meillassoux' claim that Kant is a correlationist. Kant's correlationism consists in the idea that our capacity to individuate objects of thought is founded on fundamentally contingent but essentially fixed features of our faculty of sensibility, which thereby place insurmountable constraints on our knowledge of the world. It is his Copernicanism that leads him to this position by forcing him to reject metaphysically primitive criteria of identity in favour of epistemically primitive conditions governing individuation. And I'll cut it there.
Jim?
Thanks, Peter. I think there's mostly agreements that I guess one particular topic that might bear on things that you said toward the end is when you have, and you can talk about Brandom or Sellers here in a way, maybe Brandon's misleading in certain ways, but the idea that the causal reliability aspect of perception, say, the RDR test is complete when you analyze that, you have to look at, and in one sense, you can just give an extensional characterization of the causal relationships, but if you're analyzing it, you have to explain how they came to be and why they have the structure they do, which has to do with the rules of language game and so on. Or take a phonograph record and its bumps and why it pictures the music. You can give it purely extensional causal account, but you've got to explain how it was engineered to be. So the only reason I bring that up is that might relate to a certain other thing that you have about the contingent but fixed features of our sensibility. And there's a sense in which that too in Kant goes, it's like the RDRSs in a way. It's not fixed in one sense independently of the deduction and the sorts of concepts that go along with it. So I guess just to focus on the first one first.
Can I come back? Well, basically, I think, again, this is me working from notes, so the phrase causal analyzability is perhaps poorly chosen because it suggests some kind of straightforward reduction, like you can just easily get down to. And really what I mean is precisely when you challenge testimonial authority, you never leave the space of testimonial authority. Like, you never leave the space in which only testimonial authority is allowed. Right? There's no stipulative authority allowed in. And I think this does tie into the causal analyzability of our perceptual, but it's crucially about, you have to think of this in terms of this idea of revision, of well, we have to hold some things fixed in order that we can then, from that perspective, revise other things. And that process of sort of complicated using some of our perceptual capacities and some of our experimental frameworks in order to calibrate others does ultimately enable us to pull our observational concepts away from the particularities of our perceptual systems. So, and colour is a good example here where, like, we now have ways of discriminating colour that are far more accurate and nuanced than any of our actual perceptual mechanisms on the basis of which we developed those conceptual frameworks. Does that? I mean, you might disagree that when we're flicking through a Pantone catalogue, that we're talking about the same concepts as when we're just using. But I think fundamentally we are. There's texture to the conceptual space, right? But fundamentally that's an extension. That's like a bootstrapping of our perceptual systems into a more complex range of conceptual relations, and that's across the board for our perceptual systems. That's.
I just have one quick thing.
Yeah.
The RDRS for Pegasus and so on, isn't it going to be a kind of simple answer in which Brandon's structural objectivity requires also for empirical reality RDRS of a certain kind?
Or for Pegasus.
Well, so it'd be Pegasus would be purely story relevant identifications.
Let's.
With proper names, you get RDRSs that go along with.
Yeah. Basically, yeah, I mean, I think the way I tend to think about it is because I think about it in relation to McDowell, because this is precisely why I hate McDowell, so McDowell kind of wants there to just be like, he wants there to be no difference between perceiving like objective facts and perceiving normative facts about the world. So when I respond to things, oh, that's funny, right? That's just fundamentally the same kind of thing. This is why they're not fundamentally the same kind of thing. It's not to say that you can't analyze my RDRD for funny. It's just that how that analysis relates to the actual discourse of humour is completely different. We're not going to revise our concepts on the basis of that, right? And crucially, I should point out, that's an inferential relation, right? You can describe how these are related in terms of what counts as a good reason or not, right? Certain kinds of reasons are good only certain kinds of reasons are good in science, and that's what makes science what it is.
So this is just a question of clarification. You said at one point that there's all kinds of stuff wrong with Mayasu's argument, and I don't know that I quite caught what your central
Yeah.
motivates it, but it is correlationism. You seem to be conceding that to Meillet.
I'm conceding that Kant's basically the thing I'm trying. I mean, there was another 5 slides that I didn't get to, but the point I'm trying to justify here is that Kant's Copernicanism does motivate his correlationism, but it's not identical with it, right? And in fact, we can be Kantian Copernicans without being Kantian correlationists. That's the...
So the idea is that, so this is in a way similar to the structures as in several of these papers, which will be we can get off the correlationist train and therefore avoid Meillet's critique. But if you couldn't, I mean, the correlationism still you think might be vulnerable to, I don't know if you have a view about that too.
The how correlationism is actually vulnerable is the 5 slides that I can get to. The punchline should be the scientific manifest image split. I think when I say there are epistemically primitive conditions governing individuation, I can tell you what those are, and they're fundamentally the things that the move to the scientific manifest image split pulls apart. Roughly, Kant tries to get the same thing to do several functional jobs when you actually don't need. And if you want me to say that very, very briefly, it's all to do with this, what I was talking about, autonomous referential frameworks, right? That's what you need for the unity of consciousness. Kant essentially ties together the unity of consciousness and objective validity. He wants the same thing to give you objective validity and the unity of consciousness, and that means that the forms of intuition you have in everyday experience and the ways in which you delineate perceptual invariants that give you objects in your everyday experience, those function as constraints on how you build your global framework, right? And this is where I was getting to how strong is Kant's constructivism. It's too strong, right? Because inevitably he places constraints governing the work of the imagination in everyday experience on the work of the imagination in dealing with developing scientific models and building a scientific framework. Does that make sense?
So that's how you avoid correlationism, and therefore, I see.
What you realise is that there's very loosely, I talked about the coordination, integration and revision of our global framework. So you've got an autonomous referential framework, I've got an autonomous referential framework, we come up to one another, we do the good Brandomian thing of identifying some of our things, we go like, okay, we can see that we're talking about the same thing here, so that means that I can now talk about your hometown, you can now talk about my hometown, though we've never been in the same place, right? We can glue our frameworks together. Kant thinks that this is perfectly okay, this is precisely what's going on in Kant, but Kant thinks that the conditions on doing this kind of coordination process, constrain the integration and revision process, right? Which means the sorts of mappings that we can have, not even the sorts of mappings, but the sorts of, so I'll put it in 2 different ways. In fact, I'll see if I can skip through to the actual slide I had on this, which is, if it'll actually get there quickly. Okay, you have constraints on space-time forms that can be used in building models. You have constraints on the type systems that are linked to the causal invariants that you pick out in those models, and you have constraints on mappings between models. The constraints on mappings are the result of the other kinds of constraints, right? If the only sorts of space-time, for instance, that you're allowed to represent things as being in are 3-dimensional Euclidean, right, then everything has to function in terms of homomorphisms between 3-dimensional Euclidean spaces, right? And you've got to think about, if you think about the things that populate those spaces, right, in terms of how we coordinate perception, then you think essentially that you have to have a one-on-one correspondence between things in one model and things in another model, right? Whereas if you get rid of these constraints, you can have all kinds of interesting mappings that don't preserve spatial structure and don't preserve basically set theoretic structure, right? And this is what I was sort of getting at when I was talking to you, when I was responding to Jim yesterday, is that the integration and thereby revision of the scientific image, right? This attempt to come up with a sort of unified picture of science, right, depends on ways of mapping between the different models in the special sciences that are a lot more complex and interesting than certainly Kant allows, and actually even Sellers allows. And that's the problem with the pink ice cube, actually. You can say more about the mappings between the manifest and the scientific image, and that's where you start criticising Brandom again, but I'll leave it at that point. Sorry if that's a bit...
Thanks. I'd like to ask just one question about this.
Yeah.
And the second paragraph of your
Yeah.
slide up here, where you
Yeah.
say that Kant's requiring the imagination to operate under the same conditions as scientific modeling and everyday experience.
Same is perhaps too strong.
Yeah. I'm worried that that's too strong, that what he does require is that we've got to be able to coordinate the scientific modeling with more everyday experience so that we can, identify our labs and our observational apparatus and our data sets and a bunch of nature. But I don't know that he needs to or does require more than that.
Well, the question is exactly how strong is Kant's constructivism? And for my mind, I don't think Kant is actually clear on how strong it is, because he isn't aware of the actual question of whether or not there can be a...
See, this is why I'm worried about that statement, is that I don't think Kant understood the sciences well enough to be able to anticipate
Yes,
this point.
yes, exactly.
Right? And that, remember his comments about chemistry, it'll never be more than a systematic art.
Yep.
And then he realized, oh my goodness, it is getting to be more than that.
Yeah.
And then there's, crystallography, which is still only just the most elementary versions of crystallization at the time. And so, I think that it's, at the very least, uncharitable attribute that constraint to him.
I think it has to be because, okay, so, and I had to skip Kant's account of individuation. If you break down Kant's account of individuation, you see where the functional conflations are, right? But I'd say at the bottom of this slide, right, what are the conditions that end up being constraints? On the one hand, forms of intuition, right, and they do both of these conditions do two different jobs. Right, so the forms of intuition, both are conditions on how we construct objects because they format the data that we then detect invariance in, right? But they also function as conditions of relative location of objects and so tracking them, right? And on the other hand, and I know you've written on this, transcendental affinity, right? Kant, and the thing is the way in which Kant deals with transcendental affinity is precisely in order to get the unity of consciousness, which is, it's about our ability to track perceptual invariance in everyday experience, but it applies to the whole of nature, right? It's the same condition all the way down.
Hold on. Hold on. Transcendental affinity plays a wide range of roles, and only a very minimal level is constitutive. And most of it's regulative in terms of what kinds of classifications of objects, events, and phenomena prove to be robust enough to be worth marking, whether in common sense or in scientific inquiry. But beyond an extraordinarily minimal level required for us to identify any objects and events at all in our surroundings, beyond that level is all regulated and not constitutive.
Fair enough. I mean, the thing is, I'm happy to be more charitable to Kant and say that actually, if I was saying Kant thinks that we have to imagine unobservable particles as having colour, smell and taste, right, then obviously that would be horrendously uncharitable, right? But I think Kant can be a lot more sensible than that and still ultimately place conditions that he shouldn't place, sorry, constraints that he shouldn't place in scientific modelling.
I'm concerned about your use of the term constraints in this connection. I think that that's already contorting Kant's account of empirical judgment just for ordinary perceptual judgments, much less for scientific inquiries. And
Well, the fact that space and time has to be thought as Euclidean 3 space, that's a constraint, right?
yes, but the question is what's the status and implications of that constraint? And partly it's a constraint on our securing individuating reference to particulars which we can judge and with some luck come to know. Right? Now, that doesn't tell us squat about either common sense or scientific knowledge of whatever those particulars may be that we come to know.
It functions as a condition on how you individuate them. Like, this is the thing, if you're restricted to...
Aids are not a sufficient condition.
It doesn't have to be a sufficient condition. If it limits you in terms of what things you can do... Huh?
What do you mean by limit? It's rather the case that until I localize within space and time some particulars to which I attribute characteristics, I don't even have a candidate cognitive judgment. Right? There's Kant's disagreement with random.
Yeah, no, but because again, you and this is where you get manifest scientific image, like conflations, or rather passing between them, because it isn't there in Kant, right? Like, I can have a great candidate cognitive judgment about, well, I mean, I hate to revert to kind of quantum particle examples, mainly because my quantum physics is not great, but like, I can judge those things, right? And I can judge them knowing that the metrics of the spaces that we have to use to talk about them, right, are fundamentally different and indeed not mappable in a faithful way into the space that you're saying I need in order to be able to have candidate cognitive judgments.
You can't do the QM without identifying the measuring apparatus, and that still requires classical individuation.
Yeah, but that's how you construct an autonomous reference frame, right? An autonomous referential framework, right? Like, what you need to do to have the unity of consciousness is one thing, and then what you need to do to talk about things in themselves is another. Can't
Wait a minute.
crams the
Things
two
in
together.
itself in what sense, right? This is really the problem.
Yeah.
Is that you're conflating distinct senses of that phrase within Kant.
Well, okay, sorry, I shouldn't have used that.
He's got an empirical sense of the term, he's got a transcendental sense of the term, and those are distinct from anything about Newman in either positive or negative sense.
Okay, so we're talking across Kant and the way things should, what Kant thinks and the way things should be. So let me try not to use a term like the thing in itself. Let me just talk about, like, what's real, right? Right?
I'm much happier with that.
Okay? Right? The thing is that, basically I want real objective validity. I don't want the weak kind of objective validity Kant ends up giving us, right? I want the full-blown normative standard, right? And what I'm saying is, the kinds of candidate cognitive judgments I can have on that standard, right, they aren't constrained by, they shouldn't be constrained by the ways in which I develop an autonomous way of dealing with the world in order to then coordinate my view of the world with the scientific image. Right? The scientific image is founded on the manifest image insofar as the manifest image gives you what you need to do to coordinate the various different parts of scientific models that you're going to then try and map. But the way you map them together isn't constrained by the way in which you coordinate yourself in relation to them. Does that make sense?
Yes, but it seems to be quite beside the point that I thought I was raising, so I don't know why you said it.
Sorry.
Can I just jump in and say temporal simultaneity might be a better example than jumping straight into quantum mechanics for saying that there's something that you give up that you want to just take it for granted, given this sort of
Yeah.
assumption about structure, space, and time in ordinary sort of manifest image kind of common sense. Then it turns out actually you have to give that up, and it turns out you can give it up. That's where you get the real objectivity, different from
Yeah.
examples, a little bit less example.
Well, I mean, an example that I was working on is, so basically, the position that I'm trying to get towards is, so if you want to think what's practical Copernicanism, right? Practical Copernicanism is accepting that we can externalize the imagination. Right? The role of the imagination can be played by all of our practices for simulating things, up to and including actual computational simulations of the world. Right? What are the structures that we're allowed to give those simulations? Right? They're much, much broader than the structures of the Kantian imagination. So, for instance, if you want to track migrating birds across the surface of the Earth, the only space you need is the surface of a two-dimensional sphere. That's all you need in terms of a base space in order to start ascribing data to it and unifying it into invariants, right? You can embed that in 3 space if you want. You can embed that two-dimensional sphere, and so that's great, right? But for instance, if you want to start thinking about orbital mechanics, right, and you want to start, so say you're in orbit around the Earth and you want to navigate orbit and not be hit by floating debris, right? You need 6 variables. You can't get out, and yeah, you can embed your location above the planet into 3 space, but if you do, you're not going to be able to move around and do the things you need to do. So, like, the range of models that are actually possible. So basically, I suppose what I'm arguing for is a radicalization of Kant's constructivism, which pushes it much, much further and recognizes that, in fact, there's like our capacities for construction aren't limited by the actual imaginations we've got.
Kant knows. He knows.
Yes and no.
Reread the passage about how a closed, two-sided figure may be logically possible, but it's not one that we can perceive. And even the brief remarks about magnetism. Right? Now, but each of these different spaces and reference frames you're talking about are equally well specifications of as large a reference frame as we find we ever have need to construct. And Kant is perfectly happy with our specifying reference frames in order to pay attention to systems of events and objects that have particular kinds of characteristics that we find interesting to investigate. But that those are not merely instantiations of a quite general capacity we have to conceive and perceive within 3D space. Doesn't matter to Kant.
If it didn't matter to Kant, and this is the thing, I'm willing to grant that Kant was actually very imaginative about what was possible in many respects, right? But he still identifies content and objective validity in a way that would say that idea of, oh well, maybe we can in a certain limited sense think about like a two-sided bounded shape, right? It might be logically possible, right? But that thought doesn't have content, right, in Kant's sense, because it can't be related to a construction intuition.
In what sense?
It can't be related to an objective possible experience through construction and intuition.
Okay.
Right.
But it's important that it's the demonstrative element that we can't supply. there is a logical content, or else we wouldn't have a concept at all to worry about.
Except the thing is that this is where I think inferentialism is useful for pulling away from the problems of Kant's constructivism. Is from the inferentialist framework, you can quite happily just say, look, that has content, right? We might not have I might not have the tools I need, either imaginatively or pen and paper, whatever, to do the constructions, right? I might not have the computational systems I need to perform the inversion of the sphere or whatever it is, right?
I mean, one thing, please, just, but I know you're going to finish up.
Yeah.
But what gives the content, it doesn't identify objective validity in content, because what ultimately gives the content are the empirical realizations, using your own function and implementation model, so that something satisfies the permanence of matter, but Kant doesn't specify what matter is, and so on and so forth. So it's read the appendix to the dialectic, which I'm sure you've done. That is what gives you the actual content for the second order. The categories are just second order concepts that say something better satisfy the permanence role or the causal role. He's wide open to investigation. Obviously doesn't foresee certain future things in science, but I think an understanding that content comes from the empirical realizations that those are reason regulative for Kant, and then your own function implementation model could give a more charitable.
That's a topic. That's a thing to discuss. And yeah. Well, I think there's something more. So the other thing I should say about the relationship between inferentialism and constructivism is what's great about the fact that Sellers' semantics is a functional rule semantics, right? Means that you can straightforwardly say that capacities for construction are realizing the functional role of the inferential rule.
What
Right.
does Kant mean by the verb realisieren? It has a very definite meaning that he gets from Hegel, and it has exactly to do with this and the difference between QM and string theory. Namely, string theory, we've got all kinds of theory, chock full of intention with an S, and so far, not any identifiable empirical instance in which string theory makes the slightest difference to our understanding of what's observed.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Realisieren in Kant means to demonstrate that we can locate individuals which, at least putatively, instantiate some or another concept or classification.
But what if, and this is the thing, but what if the individuation of those individuals, right? What if the conditions of individuation of those individuals within the models you're interested in, like, cut across the conditions of individuation of the land of perceptual dry and wet goods? That's the...
But then we need a scientific account of what kinds of methodology and what kinds of instrumentation, what kinds of experimental observational apparatus enable us to identify this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfectly happy with
Absolutely. But then if he's perfectly happy with it, he shouldn't basically he shouldn't be a correlationist, but he is. Like he shouldn't.
Running together the transcendental idealism with empirical realism, and there's no need to do that.
Well, there's just no need for there's no need for transcendental idealism, basically. But
Yes.
But it still is there. Anyway, well.
Okay, so we're already off on our date. It's fine. Let's only get worse. So go and have coffee and try to be back here by 12.